Deborah Lipstadt is the Dorrit Professor at Emory University and has received honorary doctorates from many institutions. She has been described by Lord Finkelstein, another of our panelists, as a gutsy girl. And that is British understatement. In 2000, she had to fight a Holocaust denier in a famous libel case in London, and many of you were here last week to watch the film Denial about the case. Her latest book, well, she has written many, so you know that. Her latest book is Anti-Semitism Here and Now. With this, she has won the National Jewish Book Award for the second time round. Please welcome Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. If you were expecting Rachel Weisz, I'm sorry if you're disappointed. Recently, a well-educated, accomplished man, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, one of America's most successful corporate entities, attended a seminar I gave on anti-Semitism. After my presentation, he raised his hand with a perplexed tone in his voice and observed, quote, "Jews are so smart, so accomplished. How is it that they have not been able to solve the problem of anti-Semitism?" I told him that his question, sincere as it was addressed in the wrong direction. He should not be asking the victim of racial prejudice to solve that problem. He should be asking the perpetrator. The purveyors of this hate and hostility should be the ones who bear the onus of having to resolve the issue. It's the rapist and not the person who has been raped who should have to supply both the explanation and the solution. However, since in this case it is the Jew who bleeds, suffice it to say, it is a problem for all of us. Now, there's no easy solution to anti-Semitism as a prejudice. Anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice. It's an irrational sentiment. So I don't know what reactive anti-Semitism is, right? Think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I know a person's qualities. I know exactly who they are and what they are just by virtue of their identity. As a colleague of mine likes to say, you meet the stereotype right in front of your nose while the person themselves is still 500 meters away. In other words, the stereotype exists independent of the individual's actions. Now, that doesn't mean that a member of a particular group in question, in this case Jews, is immune from possessing negative characteristics ascribed to the entire group. There are Jews who have negative characteristics. In fact, last week I gave testimony on Capitol Hill at the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, and I was talking about this fact, and I said, some of the people I dislike most are Jews. But the minute you move from the individual to the whole group, that is anti-Semitism. Similarly, that is racism as well if you're talking about a racial group. And the minute you say that is how they are, that's anti-Semitism. Now, while anti-Semitism is a prejudice, and as a prejudice it shares many of the characteristics of racism, homophobia, fear of Muslims, sexism, and other prejudices, it has certain unique characteristics, and I want to lay those out because I think they'll be helpful in the conversation that will follow. First of all, it is a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theorists find culprits, so to speak, to blame for something they find personally threatening. Those who subscribe to these theories tend to rely on familiar enemies. There was a joke that was supposedly told in Germany during the Third Reich by Jews of a Nazi official who comes to a meeting and is saying the Jews are our misfortune, they do this and they do that, and someone from the side of this crowded room yells out, "And the bicycle riders." And the person is confused and he says, "Why the bicycle riders?" And the person says, "Why the Jews?" In other words, it makes no sense. But you pick someone who's familiar. Bicycle riders would surprise people. But if you say it's the Jew, then it makes sense because it's a familiar stereotype. Conspiracy theorists reflexively reject facts that contradict their narrative. So logic falls by the wayside. You can't argue with a conspiracy theorist. You're going to lose out from the very beginning. Secondly, anti-Semitism has a second unique, distinctive characteristic. Most prejudices of the sort that I've been talking about tend to come from the political right, the far political right. Anti-Semitism, as we're going to hear later in more detail, comes from both the right and the left, but uses the same prejudices. It's not a distinct kind of anti-Semitism of the right is one thing, and anti-Semitism of the left is another thing, but they use the same kind of prejudices, and they fit. The charges are the same. Thirdly, when one contrasts anti-Semitism, let's say, to the prejudice of racism, another distinction emerges. The racist looks at the person of color, the black person, the brown person, often the Muslim, and says if they, quotation marks, come to our neighborhood, our country, there goes the country. If their kids come to our kids' school, there goes the school. They will bring it down. They are lesser than. Think about how some of the Nazi press, well, all the press was Nazi press in 1936 at the Berlin Olympics, explained Jesse Owens' victory. They had to explain it. How could a black man beat the fastest Aryans, not only beat them, but his athletic feet, and you can spell feet either way, and with Jesse Owens you'll be right. How could he accomplish this? And what did they say? On the evolutionary scale, he's closer to an animal than a person. Therefore, even the fastest Aryan could not beat a horse. So the racist punches down. The person of color is lesser than. The anti-Semite, who's often just the racist, just a different version, punches up. The Jew is more powerful than us. The Jew is cleverer than us. The Jew is richer than us. The Jew is out for their own good. Therefore, the Jew is to not only be loathed, but to be feared for what they might do to us. And that changes the nature of anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is delusional. Think about it. It ascribes to Jews, it says Jews are all on the left, they're all communists and revolutionaries. Or it says they're all on the right, they're Rothschilds, or today Soros has become the 21st century Rothschild. Last time I checked, you could not be on those two sides at the same time. Or the anti-Semite says Jews are pushy, they always want to be in places that don't want them. Or they're clannish, they stick together and they don't mix with others. Well, last time I checked, you can't be both things at the same time. But that's logic, and as I say, anti-Semitism defies logic. It's not something random. It is not disliking a Jew, it is disliking someone because he is a Jew. These things seem so obvious, but sometimes I think we fail to put them together. Anti-Semitism began as anti-Judaism. As Christianity emerged from Judaism and became distinctive, it also wanted to set itself apart, and in the Middle Ages, the attacks on Jews became quite intensive. But it moved out of the church. It moved to opponents of the church, people who did not love the church. Voltaire writes about Jews. He sounds like he could be a church father in his words. Or it moves out of the religion altogether to the enemies of religion, to a Karl Marx, but who uses the same kind of languages, right, left. Moves to the eugenicists in the mid-19th century. It moves, of course, to the Nazis. It takes its different forms. It is ubiquitous, and it is rightfully often called the oldest hatred. Now, a recent form, and I know many of you saw the movie, so I'm just going to touch on this briefly, is, of course, Holocaust denial. Sometimes people say to me, how can someone deny the Holocaust? And I say, you're asking a logical question about an irrational sentiment. Think about it. For a denier to be right, who would have to be wrong? The thousands, tens of thousands of documents which attest to the existence of the Holocaust. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. number one. Number two, the bystanders, the people who lived in the towns and the cities and the villages, Oswiecim, Treblinka, other Lublin, who saw the trains going to the camp filled with people coming out empty. Or all the people in the towns and the villages on the Eastern Front who watched the shootings, who saw the Jews being marched out, and sometimes even accompanied and watched it happen. But the thousands of historians who work on this all over the world would either have to be part of the conspiracy or have all been duped. And finally, the perpetrators themselves. In not one war crimes trial since World War II has a perpetrator ever said it didn't happen. They said, I was forced, I didn't have a choice, but never that it didn't happen. And of course, the German and Germany as well. So it makes no sense. Why do deniers get any traction at all? Because they rely on these age-old stereotypes. If you were to ask a denier, let's say after they've told you all these examples, mangling history and mangling the facts, the logical question you would ask is, why? What's in it for the Jew to engage in anti-Semitism? What's the logic? What's the rationale? And their answer relies exactly on anti-Semitic stereotypes. What the denier will say to you, what did the Jews, and I put this also in quotation marks, get out of the Holocaust? They would, and the denier would say, well, they got a state of Israel, which is questionable historically, but that's the general perception. And what's the other thing they got? Reparations, which is a fancy word for money. So there you immediately have the Jew is financially powerful, the Jew is very sneaky and doing things for their own purposes. So you've given the person a rationale that is logical within this illogical stereotype and makes sense to them. What about, and I'm just going to do this briefly, anti-Semitism from the left, because we're going to hear more from this from Lord Finkelstein. And for the person on the right, the far right, the shooter in Pittsburgh, the shooter in Poway, even the shooter in New Zealand who killed Muslims at 3 different mosques, for the shooter in Halle who killed 2 people, couldn't get into the synagogue, and I think whoever reinforced that door, the carpenter or whatever who put that bolt on that door in Halle should get Germany's highest award. For those people on the far right, they subscribe to something called white genocide theory, white genocide replacement theory, which essentially argues that there is a plan to replace white people, white Christians, replace white Christian culture, replace white Christians' dominance and leadership of society with black people and brown people. And that's what we see happening in Europe with the influx of refugees. But, says these people, white supremacists, racists, those people, remember punches down, those people are not smart enough, are not capable enough to be doing this on their own. There has to be someone behind them who is controlling this. There's always someone the puppeteer. Who's the puppeteer? Who's going to benefit from this? The Jew. So when they talk about George Soros funding these refugee groups coming from south of the border, or they talk about him doing it in Europe, that is, again, you're punching up. And that's what the protesters in Charlottesville meant when they marched and they said, Jews will not replace us. On the left, it comes from a worldview of Weltanschauung, which argues that Jews are white. For the people on the right, of course, Jews are not white, but that Jews are white, and Jews are all wealthy, and ipso facto, they cannot therefore be victims of prejudice. They have power. So when they come and claim that I'm a victim of prejudice, I've been a victim of anti-Semitism, they're making it up. Because it's not possible, says the person, not everyone on the progressive left, of course, but those on the progressive left who make this argument, and therefore they're making it up. And then there's the added element, says the person on the progressive left, such as Jeremy Corbyn, who we'll hear more about, or people in our country and some in the Congress and in other places as well. And I call this the Miss Piggy defense. Moi? Me? You know, how could I possibly be a purveyor of prejudice? I'm liberal to my core, So if you can't be a victim and I can't be a purveyor, you must be making this up. You must be using this for other ends. Finally, irrespective of whether it comes from the right or the left, it has that same template of financial power, cunning, clever manipulation, and used for their own benefit. What can we do about it? I'm not sure we can ever wipe it out. On some level, I think of anti-Semitism as a herpes virus, and I don't mean to be facetious at all. Those of you who know someone who have had a herpes virus, you know it can lie dormant in your body. It never goes away. It comes out at times of stress. Anti-Semitism, being the oldest hatred, is present. It's in the atmosphere. It's out there. Does that mean there's nothing we can do? Of course not. We must, expose its delusional quality, its irrational quality. We must challenge it. We must become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party and call it out. Maybe you won't change the mind of the person engaging in it, but the people around the table, especially, but not only the young people, have to recognize that this is unacceptable. We live today in a society where the moral guardrails, as I like to say, have come down, and we have to help establish them and set them up. We have to do so, and with this I close, not just for the Jew, whether we're Jewish or the Jews in our midst, though that's a good reason, and not, some people say, well, I'm not Jewish, but I have Jewish grandchildren, relatives, etc. Good reason, not sufficient. Or I hate all prejudice. Good reason, not sufficient. The real bedrock reason is no healthy democracy has ever harbored anti-Semitism and been a healthy democracy. If you have anti-Semitism within a democracy, it means there are many people who believe in conspiracies, Jews controlling, Jews manipulating. If they begin to believe in conspiracies, that is the beginning of the death of democracy. So if you care about democracy, you care about this. Thank you very much.